So I'm not gonna blow this up because I don't want to mess with it. So we'll just use it in this format. Um, Essentially, what we're here tonight to discuss is a high level overview of the draft budget that hit your mailboxes over the weekend, and you'll see that a significant chunk of this is spent talking about some of the revenue impacts that we are seeing immediately because of the coronavirus, as well as those that might be lingering in the next couple months and years. And then basically the rest of the budget flows from that discussion. We will spend a decent amount of time in our water and sewer funds talking about some projects and repair and replacement that's proposed down the line here. But just to dive right into it, some of the highlights here are going to be the revenue decreases, which results in a reduction of our capital projects that would be funded normally by the general fund and the major streets funds. We do have some equipment that we'll talk about that is budgeted, but largely, we've attempted to do a status quo budget, and then of course we'll spend a decent amount of time on the water and wastewater treatment plants as we go into those later. So just at the very beginning here, we're going to go over just a couple of notes on the revenue impacts that we're both expecting but still have some uncertainty about. So starting off with this current fiscal year that ends June 30th of 2020, the most significant revenue source that we get from the state of Michigan is our constitutional revenue sharing. That is money that comes from the sales tax generated by the state, and then it's passed through to communities based on a formula. It's constitutional, which means it's guaranteed, but the state has alerted us in a webinar 2 weeks ago that the June payment, which represents activity from March and April, is expected to have about a 50% reduction. And then beyond that, there has been no official correspondence on what to expect. So for the remainder of this fiscal year, the June payment and the August payment are both reflected in this year's fiscal year. So we assumed a 50% reduction, as the state indicated, for June, and a 40% reduction for August. So this slide just shows you what that means compared to our original budget of $318,000. It's interesting to note that the state did a revenue estimating conference in February before the coronavirus hit, and they were projecting that number to be $346,000. So, really the economy was humming along, and we were seeing that reflected in sales tax activity, which ultimately is more money for our general fund. After factoring in those reduction figures, the current year forecast was bumped down to $295,500. So not a huge difference from the original budget, but certainly factoring in where we would have been had this happened, it was a meaningful reduction. So you will see that carry forward into our projections for the next fiscal year. And so just as a refresher, the state had originally projected $353,000, again, in their February estimating conferences. We had back in early March plugged in 340 in an attempt to be conservative. And if we make some assumptions such as a 40% reduction for the October payment and then a 20% reduction for the rest of the season or for the rest of the year, that is where our number came from. So it's a $270,000 figure. That is by far the biggest impact that we are seeing right now that we at least have a sense of. We debated heavily whether that was too rosy or too harsh. And at this point, we're following the guidance that some of our colleagues have talked about because the state of Michigan has yet to give us a better sense of that. There is a May revenue estimating conference scheduled for next Friday, May 15th, and we expect that in the weeks following that, we'll have a better sense of what the state is projecting. But that right there, that constitutional revenue sharing, is our biggest expected impact in the general fund. On the general fund, there's a second piece of revenue sharing, which is called statutory revenue sharing, and that means that it is subject to an annual appropriation by the state legislature. The title of this is a little bit misleading because I've got here the current year number as well as next budget year number. It's right around $41,000. And the note here is that there's been past practice when the state faces an economic crisis to, in effect, help balance its budget by cutting aid to cities and townships. And so this figure is not protected by the Constitution, and therefore I think it is prudent to assume that the state could affect that number, whether it's a straight up removal of it or a percentage decrease. We don't know yet. The budget assumes that it's there until we know otherwise, and we have some ability to flex as this goes forward. The last piece of that conversation has been discussion at the federal level about the next wave of coronavirus relief spending to include relief for states and cities and townships. If you follow the news, there's a lot of variety of opinions about that. I don't know that right now. There's a lot of momentum for that. So we just wait and see. The state had a webinar today with the Treasury Department and the State Budget Office, and they said that there was some hope that there might be a deal struck that would include some of that flexibility for the federal support to basically plug in and replace lost revenues. But at this point, it's just wishful thinking. But that is a very real possibility. If it happens, that we could see some support there. So Holly's texting me because I can't see you all, and she says that Jeff Weiss has his hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, Corey. When I talk, I'm getting. Sounds like a baseball stadium. Sounds like a baseball stadium, and it's kind of hard to work like that. But I don't like using the headset, but you're really breaking up bad.
I think you might be a little too loud.
Okay. Give me a second here.
And I think your internet.
Let me see if I call in. Maybe that will be better. Bear with me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Jeff Weiss, is this any better?
It is much better.
Okay. I'm just making sure. I know Jeff was the one with the feedback. Can Jeff Weiss hear me and confirm?
Yep, you're good, Corey.
Okay. Can somebody let me know? Can you see my screen again?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We'll make this work. I know we're in a unique situation here. So I was just talking about the state revenue sharing on the statutory side, and again, a lot of uncertainty on what that's going to look like. Okay. So moving forward, from the state is our Act 51 gas taxes. These are taxes that come from gallons of fuel that are purchased. There's a stabler part of this which comes from motor vehicle registrations. And so what we're looking at here, obviously with a lot less people driving on the road,
trying to anticipate what that's going to look like for these motor fuel tax revenues. And so what you'll see here for the current year in our major streets fund, which the city's road system is broken down into major streets and local streets. As an example, Putnam or Middle Street would be considered major streets, and some of your neighborhood streets such as Quinlan or Williams or those in Plymouth Landing, those would be local streets. Major streets is the heftier of the two as far as the amounts of dollars we get, and the original budget was at about $293. The state in their same February revenue forecasting conference had bumped that up to about $315. And we had to make a couple of assumptions on what was going to happen the rest of the year. So for March, which there was only a shutdown for about half of the month, that payment was down about 9.5% from last year's same period at March of 2019. And so for the last 3 payments of the year, we assumed a 15% reduction. On Friday, just as we had sent all this out, the state released its latest estimates. And they did not break it down by fund, but the total between major and local was very close, within about $5,000 of the forecast that we have there between this fund and local streets fund. And so that will likely evolve, and we'll just have to see where it goes. But at this point, I feel comfortable that it matches closely to what the state came out with on Friday. For next year, you can see that first bullet point. The original draft budget assumption was for $333,000. And so what we were seeing over the last couple years is the 2015 road package, which raised motor vehicle registration fees as well as allotted of funding from the state's general fund, has been gradually increasing those funds. And so that was going to be a record number for the city. With COVID, we have reduced that anticipated number by 15%. Again, a lot of consideration here on whether that was, too rosy or not harsh enough. And I think until we get some better guidance, 15% is a fair estimate. And again, on Friday, that estimate that the state came out with, the combination of this number plus local streets was very close to what the state had out there. The same trend line follows for local streets fund, and so we use the same assumptions here. This fund, it's a smaller amount for revenue, so the percentage swings aren't quite as hefty until you get into next year, which we were on track to get over $100,000, which would have been a first, and now we're closer to 90. All right, so one last note on the gas taxes. The estimates assume that there's going to be a couple things that happen. The first of which is that part of that 2015 road funding package that was passed by and supported by Governor Snyder back then is that there was going to be this gradual phase-in of dollars from the state's general fund to infuse into the road program. And so over the course of 6 years, it was going to go from some smaller number up to $600 million. And so in 2021, it was anticipated that that program would have $600 million from the general fund, and it would be generating about $600 million from the increase in fees and taxes for gas. And so that would be a $1.2 billion program starting in 2021. So these numbers that the state released even on Friday assume that that will still happen, along with a couple other smaller numbers, which come from the marijuana tax, as well as a $33 million local road program, which has existed for a few years. At this point, I am not sure how strong of a possibility those figures are. The state, during their webinar today, said that the local, or the $600 million, I think represents about 4% of their general fund. And they said that that would be subject to being negotiated. And so take that for what it's worth. I think they were signaling that there's a possibility that that could get impacted, whether it's, again, reduced or cut we don't know. Certainly, I think there's going to have to be a prioritization, and to the extent that roads are important, maybe it doesn't get hurt as much as some other line items. But really the point I'm trying to drive home is that there's a number of uncertain things that are lingering that we have limited control over beyond attempting to lobby our legislators. And we won't know the full impact of these for I think a few weeks when we get the revenue estimating from the state, and then really into this next fiscal year. I think once we get into the fall, hopefully we will have seen the worst of the economic impacts, and we'll have a sense of what the new normal is. But those are the overarching things that are driving a lot of the decisions that are made both in the short term for finishing out this year as well as starting out next year. Are there any questions at this point just about that overall picture as far as state sharing of revenue sharing and gas taxes? Okay, I'm going to keep going. And keep in mind, I can't see any of you right now, so please chime in if needed. All right, so moving along, on the longer term, I just wanted council to be aware of some of the potential things that could be looming on the revenue side. So starting with property taxes, the tax roll for 2020 is finalized, and it has projected growth, and it's been stable. We've had several new homes that were built in the last year. We've had commercial additions, people doing additions to their houses, and then in general, our tax base has been growing. And so that is reflected in our property tax estimates, which frankly have helped navigate this because we're expecting, a decent increase in those revenues, which help offset some of the decreases that are projected from revenue sharing. And so the question really is going to be, does this economic disruption end up having an effect on the housing market? To the extent that there may be foreclosures, people can't afford to keep their houses, those are the types of things on a larger scale that can impact your property values negatively. And then the other thing that just something to keep in the back of the head is, as businesses struggle to get through this, we could face additional challenges through the Michigan Tax Tribunal to their values. And so we just have to watch for those things and anticipate that they could be coming. Again, those are not going to be as near-term impacts, but certainly over a 2-year period is when we could start to feel that. And I think that would match somewhat with a lot of communities' experiences in 08 and 09 when we had the Great Recession. Building permit and development related revenue in some communities is a large chunk of a budget and revenue projections. For us, that revenue is almost entirely a pass-through. And so it's just a point to know, you may see headlines from other communities where it's a big deal. For us, it is not as integral. And then lastly, on the water and sewer side, as I think council should be aware, we have suspended shutoffs. There was actually an executive order about that to keep people's water connected for sanitary reasons through this emergency. But at the same time, we have also not charged penalties for late accounts. And so what we've seen over the last month is that we have certainly had an increase in the number of accounts that would normally be on a shutoff list. And then just on Friday with our new billing cycle, Rachel was able to produce the number of penalty that we would have had we applied it. And so just as a trend line, in December, that number was about $1,700. In January, it was $1,800. February, it was $1,600. March, it was $1,900. And then in April, it was about $2,500. So to the extent that, that's an indicator of people not paying their bills, I think that in the long term, the city will be able to collect those funds. Ultimately, we have the ability to assess those past due balances to a tax bill. That is not going to be our first move when all of this is lifted. We're going to work with people and try to get them caught up, just by working with folks on payment plans. But if it does continue, into June and those numbers start getting higher, we could have a short-term cash flow issue. I don't think we're going to get there, but it's something to be aware of as we get into the summer months. Okay, so we're just going to talk a little bit about operations and some capital equipment that is in the budget. So this budget, we have not had to resort to layoffs or not filling positions at this point. We are holding off on filling our seasonal
Corey?
positions. Yes.
Hey, it's Jeff. Can I just interject real quick before we kind of
Sure.
move on to the operational aspect?
Yes.
So after all those updates, is there anything that we know of? I understand that Williamston is a charter-wise very heavily city manager aspect. We don't have a mayor that's voted by the people and has authority potentially over the governor. But have we done a level of research that we know of at this point where we know what we can and cannot do as it relates to these executive orders by the governor as well as the federal government to drive more revenue potentially if we get to a point mid-May, end of May, where we say, you know what, maybe Williamston wants to start opening up more things. Do we have to wait for other things to happen before we can do that? Where are we at with the research on that as it relates to our own particular city of Williamston?
Are you talking the private side, like the businesses in town?
Yes.
Okay. We have not pursued that at this point as far as the research there. The way that I guess I interpret that question is there something the city could do to essentially overrule or override a state order? So we have not looked into that at this point. Frankly, I would want direction from council on that, before we pursued something along those lines.
Yeah, and I think we'd want to be informed on what your authority could even be, right? I mean, we're
Sure.
obviously in a very unique scenario, and yeah, because everything we're talking about here relates to revenue, tax revenue. It's we're making projections, but are we fully informed on what we could do that, because as I've always understood it from my first day in law school and forward, is it's a bottom up when it comes to health and welfare. And so a village mayor, when it comes to health and welfare, can overturn in a way what a governor tries to impose on an entire state. So at the end of the day, you have scenarios where you can't make it more strict, but you can give more rights. You can always give more rights. And so if we were ever in a position where we could open up more things sooner, that would not be in violation of our authority as it relates to what the governor is doing. So I just didn't know if you'd explored those aspects of it. And if you haven't, I'd encourage everyone else on council, maybe we should encourage a direction to, explore exactly what we can and cannot do. I'd like to just be informed on that, right?
Okay.
Because we're unique, right? We don't vote in the mayor, right? City council votes who the mayor is. So we're a different type of municipality, right? So yeah, anyone else have thoughts there? I mean,
yeah, I'd certainly like to know what our options would be, what authority we would have, or what authority Corey would have.
I think it's definitely a question for Tim. That right now it looks like the 15th. I don't think where things could start opening up. I don't feel, moving much past that. It's something to look at, but right now, I don't. I guess it's my opinion. It's a question for Tim. Have him research it, and then we could discuss it from there.
Hey, it's Jeff here. Hey, Jeff Rowland, I 100% agree with you. And I'll tell you, in my day job, I think what we're talking about is Executive Order 2020-69, which, in all intents and purposes, continues on with 2020-43, which was the closure of businesses. Now, I know in other places, May 15th is opening day for government. Government offices are opening. Now, I know that this 2020-69 extends the closure of businesses until May 28th. So, as I understand it, the legislature the House has filed a suit against the governor. And I know that many municipalities are waiting to see what the results of that suit are going to be on the closure until May 28th. But as we know on social media, many places are opening otherwise. So that's in my other life, we're waiting for that order. But I can tell you that I think it's worth a consultation with our corporate counsel to see what their thoughts are on that. And I agree with Jeff.
Okay, I've got the notes, everybody's thoughts on that, and we can certainly explore that.
Yeah, I also agree. I had a short discussion before the meeting with Holly just to ask some of those individual questions. And going back to the charter, we look at that at a good deal closer to see that may play part. And also use him as a reference. So good job on everything. I think it should be looked at.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that topic? Okay. All right. We will look into that, and for the purpose of this meeting, keep moving through here. So just a couple highlights operationally. As I mentioned, I think where I left off is that we've held off on filling some of our seasonal positions through our Department of Public Works at the moment, and we'll simply evaluate that as we have a clearer picture of work and revenue. We had discussed back a couple months ago the idea of having a part-time zoning planning position. And so what you'll see is the budget keeps the funding in that planning, zoning, community development department, but we are not yet pulling the trigger on coming to you to try to fill that position as we get through this. Part of that is driven by, we just don't think we're going to have a great deal of new development in the very near term, and so that gives us a chance to kind of pull through this and see where we're at in a few months. From a personnel perspective, on the collective bargaining front, a couple things to be aware of. So our police union bargaining agreement is set through the end of 2021. However, there is a clause that allows either party to do a reopener, and we fully expect that will come to the table. Right now, we're just working through the timing of that, but we do expect that will be requested as a reopener. On the DPW perspective, the current bargaining agreement ends at the end of this year, and so bargaining will take place toward the latter part of 2020. And so both of those things will have impacts on potentially economics, such as wages or benefits. On the benefit front, a couple of notes. We basically just assumed a 10% increase in health insurance rates starting on 1/1. Our health insurance renews on a calendar basis. And on the next slide, you'll see some discussion on our pension system, which is through the Michigan Employers Retirement System, or MERS. And so here we continue to fund both our closed traditional pension plans as well as our newer hybrid or defined contribution plans. And I wanted to just ask Rachel here to take a couple moments to describe what we are doing as far as our surplus pension account, if Rachel could chime in.
Sure. Back in December, I believe it was, we brought it to council to request that any surplus monies that we were paying over and above our required contributions to go to this surplus division. And the intention of that surplus division is to pay down that liability. So we have a significant liability for all of our divisions. We're about 73% funded, which if you're paying attention to the news before COVID-19, that was a huge discussion point at the state level on local governments and what that unfunded liability was for retirement systems. And so this surplus division allows us to take any contributions that we're making over and above the requirement and putting it into a separate division, so it funds down that liability and doesn't impact what our rates will be in future years. So I think I use the analysis, the example of when you pay extra on your mortgage, you're not asking the mortgage company to re-amortize your loan. You're basically doing that to pay off that principal sooner. And that's what the surplus division is doing for our retirement fund. In December, council voted to allow us to contribute $626 a month towards that surplus division, which is annualized. It's about $3,800 for this current fiscal year that we're in. And so that's the level that we've budgeted to maintain for next fiscal year. The monthly contributions that we're making to MERS right now are $16,369, and we wanted to continue that. Although our rates went down, or our required contribution went down starting July 1, we would like to continue to make that $16,000 contribution to help to pay down that unfunded liability sooner. And so that's what is included in this budget that's being proposed.
Thank you for that explanation, Rachel. A couple final pieces on retiree liabilities. So MERS, on an every couple year basis, they amend their investment return assumptions, as well as other factors such as their mortality tables. And all of those things are used by the actuaries to figure out what the liability is for each of their pensions they manage. And so they have announced that they will be making those changes again, which will impact not this coming July 1st, but the following July 1st, and then another year in the future. So 2021 and 2022, our contributions will likely continue to go up because they are dropping their investment assumption returns, as well as amending other assumptions such as people living longer. And so that is par for the course for the last few years of how MERS has managed those types of factors that go into their actuarial forecasts. But it's just something that we have to be aware of. And I think doing this surplus contribution by holding our contribution level at the current years is going to help us in the long run. It may not sound like a lot, but every little bit that we can get into that fund is invested. And obviously right now it's not the best time, but over the last 10 years, it has performed very well by being in with MERS. The last thing, this is just a refresher and an update. So the city has ended the ability for new hires to have retiree health care, which are sometimes called OPEBs for other post-employment benefits. However, that didn't happen, I think, till 2013 or 2014. So we do still have that liability that lingers. We currently have 4 retirees that take the retiree health insurance, and they're eligible until they turn Medicare eligible, which is 65. So I think 2 of the 4 are within a year or 2 of hitting that date. And so that will bring some relief until, we have the next retiree. But that's something just to be aware of, because it is a real budget impact. And we have a line item now that beginning last year, we break up all those things by department. So you can see exactly what each of those items cost. Okay, on the capital side, not an exhaustive list, but just a quick overview. So this year we had funding to purchase a replacement patrol vehicle for the police department. That purchase was deferred, and we are budgeting to do that replacement in 2020, 2021. We also have a replacement server for our DPW building, and that is budgeted at $5,000. If you remember, this year we replaced the City Hall server, and so this is part of our proactive management of those servers. There are also various PC replacements that are planned throughout each department in the city. In the DPW, in our equipment fund, the main highlights continue to be our payments on the leases that we did for the Vector truck, as well as the loader. So those right there total about $102,000. We have 3 years remaining on those payments. And then we have a couple of smaller requests within the equipment fund. We have a hydraulic water main saw, which is an attachment that could be used with our Vector truck. So it's actually powered by the water, which can be used to do a safer cut when we have water main breaks and issues in a trench. Along those same lines, there's a $11,000 request for the trench box panels to keep our guys safe in those trench holes. And then there's a truck topper, which is going to be somewhere between $4,000 and $8,000. We budgeted $8,000. And I was just going to have Scott chime in for a few minutes on that. That is a lingering request from the van purchase that we had. And Scott just kind of briefly introduced that concept. But if you could, Scott, just talk for a minute about that and refresh council.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. The truck topper, when the city authorized us to get the flatbed that was put on one of the pickup trucks a few years ago, the van request that we came to you for back earlier this year, that van is also used in the wintertime to haul salt around and that type of thing. And it ended up eating up the van, the interior, all the way to the point the bed had rusted through. The springs had come through in the bottom of the van. So after analyzing the uses of the different vehicles and such, we thought that it was a better plan to use that aluminum bed, flatbed, and have a topper made that fits over top of that so that we can repurpose that during the winter time. It can have a coating on it and so forth. Actually, it already has a coating on that bed, and the salt won't eat into that. And then in the summertime, we can take that topper off, have it for the other uses that are used in there. Kind of a lower cost way of not having to have a vehicle that gets eaten up as fast. So does that make sense to you guys? You remember that conversation we had with the van? Okay. The trench box panels, we have a trench box system that is a multi-piece type system where you have, different corners and pieces and parts like a Lego set that goes together. They've come out with a new part of it that has, like on one end, you can have these panels that go down in, and you can go around a pipe, but be above the pipe and then down on both sides of the pipe. And it adds to our existing system. The hydraulic water main saw, as Corey indicated, hooks up to the Vector truck, and the Vector truck is often at water main breaks, and this thing works off of the oil hydraulics of the Vector truck, powers the saw. The saw looks very similar to a chainsaw. It has a diamond blade type chain that's on there, and you can just chop right down into the water main without having to dig a bigger hole that our circular type saw has to go all the way around the thing. So it's safer for the guys in the long run and gets the breaks done faster. So any questions?
All right.
We do know that there's other bigger expenses planned in the future. We have things looming in the future with an assault truck that's coming at us and some other items, backhoe that we're watching. So we're trying to keep pushing those things out as far as we can. So this, with the bigger payments on the Vector and the loader, smaller requests this year for other things. Next year, we've also got a couple of pickup trucks that are up for replacement as well, but not in the current fiscal year we're talking about.
All right. Thank you, Scott, for that. And then just to finish up this slide, so there's a couple of things that have been in our budget this year that were discussed as deferrals to a future year. So we have, there's the non-rotary pavilion at McCormick Park, which is suggested to be deferred, as well as some of the City Hall building needs. And so we alerted you, I think even going back 2 years, maybe 3 years, about the staircase on the east side of the building that heads up to the top of City Hall, to the attic area and the storage area. It has some needs there. The roof has needs that aren't immediately observable from the outside, but certainly from the attic space. There's been evidence of water and leakage. And then just this late winter, we had a real pest issue that I think any of our staff can tell you how bad it was. But we basically had just a series of really bad smells in City Hall, and through various forms of investigation, at the end of the day, we think that it was shrews that took up residence in the City Hall walls. And we were able to catch a few of those. The smell has since dissipated for the most part. If it gets kind of really sunny, you can smell it a little bit, but certainly the brunt of the smell has gone away. And so just before this COVID everything happened, we were working. We had a couple different pest companies in, and finally had some success with one of them. And their recommendation included spending a couple $1,000s to deal with many of the voids that exist in this old building. But he, like another person we had come in and look at it, felt that there were some other structural issues on the outside of City Hall with the brick facade that he felt would be better served by a contractor as opposed to a pest company. And so we really just had that meeting like May 16th, I think it was, the first day of shutting down restaurants and all that. And so we haven't moved on that. We have kept a bit of funding in our operational budget for repairs that could be related to that. But in the meantime, we've put a cap on some of these general fund capital expenses. So those types of things aren't going to go away. But when you're facing with so much revenue uncertainty, typically you look to defer some of those types of major capital expenses. Speaking of that, there was a request from Scott and the DPW to include funding in the Major Streets Fund to do a crush and shape of High Street from Cedar to Putnam, which is basically from, if you can imagine, the entrance of McCormick Park down to the St. Mary's Church. If anybody, I mean, there's a lot of roads in town that need help. That one is in particular pretty bad. And so before, when we had potentially record levels of major street funding, there was a chance that we could have actually done that. Short of that revenue coming in, it does not seem likely. And so we've just listed that as deferred because it was actually contemplated this year.
Hey, Corey,
So
I have
yeah.
sorry to interrupt. A quick question while we were on this topic. I think it was last year, you and Scott did a really good job with the grant for the Riverwalk. And I don't remember when that was scheduled to come in, but I remember there was a rather large match attached to that. But was that for this coming fiscal year, or is that still further out in the future?
Yeah, it would be for this coming or the next one, based on the state budget. And Dan, I promise we will have more on that when we get to our DDA area.
Gotcha. Sorry to jump ahead.
No worries. Okay, so the next few slides, really until the end, it's going to take a more critical look at each fund. And so the general fund we spent a lot of time on that, and so this is largely refresher. But the main thing I wanted to point out was that in addition to what we've talked about on revenue sharing and property tax revenue, there's a third piece of revenue that we get from the state, which is a reimbursement for the loss of personal property taxes that stemmed from, it was a ballot proposal several years ago, which means that small businesses that have less than, I think, $80,000 in personal property tax no longer have to pay that. And then there's eligible manufacturers that no longer have to pay it on their industrial type equipment. And so the state has a very complicated formula for reimbursing those losses to cities. And it's been going on now, we might be going on year 4 or 5, and the swings in the amounts have been dramatic. Finally, in the last 2 years, for Williamston, it has stabilized a bit. And so there's 2 pieces to that. One, which is to make up for the minimum loss that we get in the fall. And then there's a piece that we get in May, which is based on the extra money that the state generated. And so there has not been a whole lot of focus on that from the state when we talk about COVID losses in the state's budget. For us, that May amount, I think, has been about $5,000. So it's not a huge number, but to the extent that the state tries to look for funding, we budgeted that conservatively for the personal property tax loss. On the expenditure side, just a couple things that I wanted to highlight. So first of all, in the budget printout, you'll see in areas that we wanted to highlight something, there's a blue line underneath the line item that will give you a footnote. And so some of the things that you'll see, that's where we will highlight where there's computer replacements. Also wanted to point out that compared to this year and even the year before, the elections department will look high, and that's because we have 2 elections in this fiscal year. And so, it's a difference. This year, I think it was 3,000. Next year, it's 6,000. But last year, I think it was 0 because we didn't have an election. And so we just want to point out that, that is a cyclical expense. And then the last piece is in our parks department. There's a fair amount of money that we've budgeted the last few years in equipment maintenance, building maintenance, and contracted services. And so we've been able to do a fair amount of work in our parks through those line items. And one of the ones that has been kind of looming has been Volunteers Park. And so the city partnered with the Volunteers group, which bought the playground equipment, but we had our time spent putting in the concrete border and some of the landscaping. And we had planned back in the winter months that the next phase of that was for the Volunteers Park to put in a pavilion with some of our in-kind work to do the foundation or the concrete work for that, as well as potentially some of the concrete work leading up to the Putnam side sidewalk. And so Rachel's been our liaison to the Friends group for several years now. They had a meeting last week, and she signaled to them that, you know, we've put some of those things on pause. They've indicated that they're putting some of their fundraising, or at least some of their more major donations, on pause. And so, you know, we're not really sure where that's going to go, but given some of the revenue uncertainty, you know, we're hesitant to commit the city to, you know, any sort of expenses there. There is one piece that's still looming that the city does have an obligation for, which is when the city sold the community center a couple years ago, the purchase agreement had in there that the city would install a fence on the western side of Volunteers Park near the property line. And that we've held off on, trying to wait till the rest of the park was established. And so our plan was to wait on that until the pavilion was decided and put in, to make it easier for construction work to happen. And so that is also lingering out there, looming, and that is a city obligation that exists for that park. So, you know, if that is basically an area that we would look to defer some things if, for example, the state cuts statutory revenue sharing by half or more. And so those are some areas that we look at as, you know, the budget has it planned, but we're not going to run and do some of these things in July and August until we have a better sense of what revenue is going to look like. So to bottom line it, the general fund anticipates revenues less expenditures, resulting in a positive $7,000. So the general fund is balanced despite some of the revenue picture that looms. And that is largely because of our deferring of projects. So this picture here, if you can see my cursor, it shows the general fund's fund balance at year end since 2009. And so you can see the city has done a good job of maintaining a solid, healthy fund balance. Going into this year, we had expected that the 2020 column would be actually much lower than that. And again, because we've deferred some work, it's going to end up a little better than we had forecasted back this time last year. And so, you know, we're roughly staying even, and that's assuming everything happens as planned, which is never usually the case. And I think the city's done a good job of typically coming in a little bit better than projected. So what does that mean as a council and prudent financial management? There's a various number of benchmarks that are used for what a fund balance should look like. The Government Finance Officers Association, the GFOA, will typically say you want to have 2 months of expenditures. I think there's another benchmark out there, like 15% of your expenditures. You know, I've worked full-time for 3 municipalities, and we've always strove to be much higher than that for times like this, frankly. And, you know, we're projecting that with the current year's forecast bleeding into next year's beginning fund balance, that we would have about 58% of our annual expenditures in fund balance. Now, 100% of that is not spendable. There's a piece of that shows up as it's an amount that's due from our water fund from a project that happened several years ago of about $100,000, and the water fund is in the process of paying that back. But rest assured that the cash balance is very healthy and projected to be healthy, assuming our forecast for revenues that get us through the end of June, and then beginning of next year, you know, come in where we think they're going to be. Any questions or thoughts on the general fund at this time? Okay, hearing nothing, I'm going to move on to our street fund.
So this is Jeff.
Yep,
I mean,
yep.
Awesome. I mean, this looks great, very well thought out. I mean, I feel super informed on what you're presenting here. I just just want to reiterate what I think you've already said, that the constant talk about the loss in revenue or anticipated revenue based upon the, you know, novel scenario we're all involved in now as a municipality. The city has contemplated that and made an educated guess to put certain projects aside so as to become back into a cost neutral state. And so I just want to kind of get a confirmation on that, you know, from you, that, you know, that's where we're at, that we've knocked some things aside to ensure that we're not just diving straight into the red.
Yes, Jeff, that is a perfect way to put it. Part of the reason why, you know, we're deferring these things is I do not feel it would be prudent to spend down fund balance when we have some of these uncertainties hanging over us. I guess I didn't say this, but I should have, is that if the state opens up and, you know, revenues are flowing again for sales tax and income tax, and we find out come September, October that some of these forecasts were too harsh, we would certainly want to revisit with council some of these things that we've put on the deferred list in anticipation of those revenues coming back in at a stronger level. But until we have that, and as much as I wanted to sit here and say we knew, I just had to get over that because we don't. And so we've tried to present something that's conservative, that doesn't slash services, you know, too far ahead of time from actually knowing what that full picture looks like.
Appreciate that feedback. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so as everybody I think knows, you know, we are a fund-based government, so general fund is our unrestricted fund. When we get into the street funds, these are restricted funds in the sense that they can only be used for roads and right-of-way type projects and operational expenses. So just a little bit of history on the Major Streets Fund. There was a project that was done in the early 2000s, which generated a bond payment annually of, I think, about $150,000. That necessitated the need for the general fund to basically subsidize the Major Streets Fund, and that was about $55,000 annually. One of the really nice things about this 2015 road package is that it has gradually allowed the Major Streets Fund to subsist on its own. And you know, prior to this all happening, you know, it was projected to not need a general fund transfer and still be able to do some minor work out in the system here and there. So obviously with that going away, that makes it a little bit more precarious. That said, because of the general fund situation and the fact that the Major Streets Fund has enough fund balance to get through this year, I'm not recommending a general fund transfer. That said, this fund is going to spend down about $52,000 to $53,000 of its fund balance to get through this year. And so there's a couple of options that exist based on some of the things that we're proposing. And so the first of those is that we have provided a preliminary engineering budget of $20,000 for what will eventually be the North Putnam Street project. This is the next project that the city is eligible for an MDOT grant of $375,000 for. This is the same program that was used over the last 4 years to do the first part of Middle Street, and then just this last year, the end part of Middle and Mullet Street. And so Putnam Street is an eligible road, and there's a project in the works that would redo the road surfacing, sidewalks, curb gutter, as well as some significant underground issues with the water and the sewer that exist on that street. That is a 2023 project from the state's perspective, which means it could start in October of 2022. For all intents and purposes, that would not be our plan, obviously, heading into the winter, but we want to get that project to a point where it could start in the spring of 2023. And when you go through the MDOT process and all of their benchmarks, we really are getting to a point in time where we should be starting to invest in that project to get us ready in this fiscal year for the next year's design process that MDOT requires. And so there, between that at $20,000 and our capital preservation funding, which is about $25,000, that is really why we're spending down fund balance. And so if there's not a comfort with spending down $52,000, either of those things could be put off or delayed, or the general fund would have to provide a subsidy to make it even. I'm not recommending those things. I really wanted council to be aware, that we are going to take a hit in that fund. And I guess the hope here is that we are going to weather this revenue issue and that we should see us back at a higher revenue amount that the state was originally projecting, within the next year of this crisis from a revenue perspective. Any questions there at this point? Okay, moving on to the local street fund. Similar story here. The local street fund is not able to function without a general fund transfer. That amount has typically been about $60,000 a year. We are projecting putting in $50,000 in this next fiscal year. The fund has a healthy fund balance of about around $100,000, and we are proposing that we're going to use just a bit of that, about $5,800 of it. And really the key reason for that is that we have this looming issue with the Wallace Street Bridge, and I'm going to show you a map of that. So to orient yourselves, this is Putnam Street, basically south of the railroad tracks. Wallace Street is one of the two roads that takes a westerly route off of that road. And so you've got some of your more, your neighborhoods that developed, I think, in the 60s and 70s. And then down here you have the Williamsburg subdivision. So if you keep going, there's actually a right-of-way that goes all the way over to the city limits right here. This road is a gravel surface and it services a single parcel that is in Williamstown Township. That is where I'm circling right now. So as part of this right-of-way that the city owns, there's a bridge that goes over this drain, which has had some emergent issues. And so from a planning perspective, the city every couple of years has to have a inspection done on the two bridges that we have, which is the Wallace Street Bridge and the bridge that goes over the Red Cedar River on Putnam Street, just by McCormick Park. The result of the bridge inspection, which is administered through the Michigan Department of Transportation, has revealed the need to do what's called a level 2 scour analysis on this bridge. And effectively, that project, which is just an analysis, it's not an actual fix, is going to run about $17,000. And so in planning for what to do with this bridge, Scott and I have had discussions about trying to get out of owning this bridge in some way, shape, or form. And so there's some potential issues of doing that with both the state as well as the fact that this bridge crosses a drain, which is overseen by the county drain department. You have the issue of the resident that it services, and that's their only way to access their property. And so it's a complex issue that is in need of a solution, as well as significant time and study to figure out exactly procedurally and legally how the city might divest itself of that right away. And so we are not proposing that we fund the level 2 scour analysis. Rather, we are proposing that we have some funding to further explore this. I don't quite yet have a sense of what that's going to look like, other than there will be some time with our attorney. He's been briefed on that issue, and it is something that we fully intend to spend some time on here in the first part of this next fiscal year. And so whatever ends up happening, there's no way for the city to do that without council involvement. We have certainly relinquished right-of-way before, and there's a resolution process that's involved in that. But we're certainly going to take this one very carefully and look out for the city's interests in that corridor right there. All right, just going to pause again and ask if there's any questions.
I have a question on the Wall Street Bridge one there, Corey. Has there been any discussion with the township and them possibly, because it is a township resident that pays taxes to them, but if we control their access, is there any way we could come into agreement for a special assessment that the township makes that we administer? I mean, I'm sure that's something we can be talked about with Tim or whatever, and the options or whatever, but right. I'm sure.
Yeah, so we have not approached anybody about that, whether it be the township or the folks that it serves. We're really at kind of the beginning stages here, but Dan, some of the terms you use, special assessment and dealing with the township, those are definitely on our radar.
Okay.
All right, so last bit of information on roads. So at some point, we needed to discuss this post-COVID. There was certainly has been momentum to bring forward a bond millage request to the voters. We've had countless work sessions, and in March, we had asked council to pass the agreement for bond council to draft the millage resolution, which was drafted, and then we had COVID happen. And so I've heard from a few council members on, concern about going to the voters during this crisis, where people are out of work and certainly businesses have been hit hard. And so, we are in a bit of a time crunch now as we do some planning here. We would have one meeting left to potentially adopt a resolution to put that forward in August. If there was a desire to change that to November, then we would have a little bit more time. But really, it felt like an opportune moment to throw that question to council and, see if there was a sense of if you wanted this still to come forward, or if there was a desire to, not bring that forward given the circumstances out there.
I'm just going to jump in here. It's my thought that it's not with the financial hit a lot of the businesses are taking, a lot of the financial hit that a lot of our residents are taking. It's not responsible of us to ask for a tax increase in August. I think if, as we all hope, the economy comes back and revenues come back, it's something we could look at early next year, but I don't think it's something we should look at for the August ballot.
Yeah, Jeff Weiss here. I agree with Dan. I don't think in any way, shape, or form we should put this on, at least for August. And again, maybe next year. NISA, I think, is moving forward with their ballot language for August. Don't know if that's wise, but I don't think it's wise for the city.
Can we push it to November and then reevaluate when when that, I guess, time frame starts to close in on us, and then if it's just not going to be feasible, then just kick it to next year?
Gene, this is Corey. Yeah, that's an option. I don't know what that deadline is right off the top of my head, but I think it's later into the summer or early part of summer, and so that would give us a chance to see where we're at and go from there. But really that August deadline was the more pressing one. And, that was what I was looking to get a sense of before we just plop it on an agenda.
Yeah, and this is Jeff. I mean, real quick, was it only 4 roads, or was there something else in there? Or was it just roads to repair?
The way it was drafted, Jeff, it's basically an all-encompassing road right-of-way request. And so it would allow the city flexibility to use it for anything in the right-of-way, whether it's a road, storm sewer, sanitary sewer pipe, or water main. And so that was the way that it was drafted, deal of flexibility. I think in practice, a majority of that would have gone to actual roads.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I definitely concur on the delay.
The language that we've had drafted that I think we went over this at council, was what, a $2,000 non-returnable fee for having that language brought up. Kicking this down the road some, we can use that language for a later ballot initiative, correct?
Yes, Dan, I think that is the case. There would be probably some dates that would have to change, but I think that could just be done by staff. I mean, it's an editable document.
Thank you.
I agree with moving it to November and then assessing it as we move along.
Okay, I appreciate everybody weighing in on that. With that said, we're going to keep moving here. So we talked a little bit already about the equipment fund. I won't spend a significant time going over that again. I just want to point out that Scott had mentioned that we do have several larger pieces of equipment that are looming. If the forecast that we've put together comes true, we will end next fiscal year with about $270,000 in cash and investments reserved, which gives us a decent starting point, for considering some of those things down the road. This picture, it's not really meant for you to dive into, but it's just a sample of the 20-year capital improvement plan that Scott updates on a regular basis. This is just the equipment piece of it. And so they do a great job of attempting to plan out the useful life of all of the machinery and the equipment and the trucks that the DPW utilizes. And if you kind of focus your eyes into, these two areas here, you can see that there are several things, whether it's trucks or, the backhoe, some big pieces of equipment that are out there lingering. Okay, so we're getting toward the end of this. The heaviness part is our water sewer funds. And so kind of along the same lines of the slide on the road conditions and, trying to be respectful of, what's out there as far as folks in our community, whether it's businesses and residents. We've attempted to build this budget without recommending a rate increase on the water or the sewer side. And so we have made some assumptions about usage. That usage will be normal. I will note, and I forgot to mention this earlier, just in April alone, we were down about 8% in our usage, and a majority of that usage, the decrease in usage has been attributed to our schools not being in session, several of our restaurants doing takeout only, as well as some of our businesses. And so you can actually, as staff, we can look at their accounts and their usage, and some of the decreases are just I guess they're not a surprise because it's shut down, but when you look at a school that is pretty consistent on how much it uses across their entire campus, that has plummeted to basically what a house would use in a month. And so we are seeing those impacts here in our forecasting. So we're assuming that once we get back into the summer and the next fiscal year, and school, hopefully being back in session and all that, that we're going to see a return to our normal usage levels. The other big piece of revenue on the sewer side comes from the industrial surcharge revenues that we have to charge to Old Nation for their high strength waste. And so as you look through the budget, you'll see that, that is a sizable dollar amount, which is used to offset the additional expenses for both operating supplies, treatment chemicals, sludge hauling, equipment repair. And so we've made a couple of assumptions based on where we think that's going to head in the next couple months. There has been, throughout all of this, some positive momentum that Old Nation has made on a solution that would essentially remove their high-strength waste from our waste stream. They have a consultant that they've been working with who has been in touch pretty regularly with Scott over the last couple weeks. And it's my understanding that they are moving along and we should be having a submission of a plan of what they're going to do internal to their building as well as to the outside. And so those plans are still forming. And at a point in time where we have a better sense of what that's going to look like, we'll let council know. But they are moving. This is about as positive of momentum as we've seen on this in the last year or so. And so in the meantime, they continue to be charged for that high strength waste per our ordinances regarding high strength waste. And we basically assume that it's going to continue for a couple of months into the new fiscal year, but that eventually, they will be diverting their waste stream. And so we will not see that surcharge revenue, which means we should not see some of the higher treatment and operating expenses going forward. All right. On the expenditure side, there's a lot of helpful notes that are in the blue line in those line items. And so some of the things that we just wanted to point out is that there's a number of looming equipment repair needs that are in the system, both for lift stations as well as at the plant. And so there's a couple of significant items that are funded in the equipment repair and maintenance items within the plant. The most significant of that is the cleaning and repair of the north clarifier, which I'm going to have Scott shed a little bit of light on that, as well as some of the needs with the generator, because that is also a big ticket item. If Scott could chime in on a couple of those items.
Yeah, the clarifier, if you ever look like on Google, the Google Maps, you look down on the plant, you'll see these big circular chambers. That's where the process comes in and the waste comes in, and you try and accelerate the biological process. It goes to these clarifiers, and that material settles out of them. We have to take them down out of service one at a time every so many years and do maintenance work on them. There's seals that are down below. There's steel that's in there that starts to rot away and needs to be replaced and welding done on it and so forth. On top of it, the overall mechanisms are now, 25, 30 years old on that too. So we're anticipating much bigger repairs to be done in the larger project that's looming out there that we've been talking about on and off. But in the meantime, we still need to take it down and do some of this intermediate repair work. What we don't know is we could get into a situation like we found with the grit chamber last year, that we pulled that apart and then found out, oh my gosh, we got to spend 5 figures here to fix something. We might get out of this less than those numbers. I'd be very happy if we get out of it for $5,000 to $8,000, but we're trying to plan that we're going to find a few things that we need to do. The generator, we've had that all the generators on the water and wastewater side stress tested in the last year, and as a part of doing that, we found that the generator at the wastewater treatment plant, the radiator itself is not functioning correctly anymore. And that generator is from the 1980s. You can't buy a replacement anything for it just about. But to replace the whole generator, you're talking about probably 6 figures. We can have a custom made radiator built for this. We've talked with Kat about it. And so we're planning to do that as the option, because the main engine and everything else, it's probably going to run for the city for many, many years to come, but it's just going to take some specialized, customized things like the radiator being special built. That's not an uncommon thing to do with these. I've been at other municipalities that have, diesel engines that have been running for 50, 60 years before, but you have to do this kind of thing to keep those going sometimes. Does that kind of cover it, Corey?
Yes. So some other things there that I skipped over as I went right to the plant repair is that you'll see some increases in our operating supplies, which is to continue replacing old lab equipment. We've had a number of those things come through this year with more planned for next year. You'll see treatment chemicals continuing to rise, as well as our contracted services, which is largely where our sludge hauling is charged to. And we are right now at about 3 sludge hauls a year. And that has been certainly driven by the high strength waste that we are receiving from Old Nation. And so to the extent that that eventually has a solution, we would expect that to decrease. But we're continuing to fund that as if there'll be at least 3 in the next fiscal year. And so there's a number of other things identified for equipment repair replacement. And so I just want to spend a minute going over what that means for the fund itself. And so last year, a big piece of the discussion on water and sewer was the need to put the funds in a position where they were generating enough surplus to meet what's called our USDA RRI obligation. And so when the city issued bonds, 2010, 2011 era, to build the water treatment plant and to do a series of work within the sewer plant and sewer system, that created an obligation from the federal government for the city to set aside money each year for repair, replacement, and infrastructure investment. That number is about $80,000 in the sewer fund. And this year, we're at a point where we are able to do that and meet that obligation. Actually, in that fund, we've been ticking away pretty well for the last couple of years. And we should end this year with around $470,000 in that RRI account. And so without the rate increase, we are projecting that the fund will have a surplus of $17,000, which means that all of these things that we just talked about will have to come from next year. And so at the end of the day, that's fine, and that's what the RRI is there for. It's just a little different than the goal we set out last year, which was to try to build that amount so that with some of these larger looming things, like if we have to rebuild an entire lift station, which can be in the 6 figures, that we are positioned with cash to be able to do some of those things. And so that is the recommendation, to utilize that funding next year so that we can take care of some of these needs at the plant without having to come to council and ultimately the ratepayers with a rate increase request. You'll see as we get into the water side that we have a very similar setup over here. And so we are attempting to build this budget without a rate increase, but we're also assuming that usage and customers will remain normal. On the water side, some of the highlights, again, are going to be noted in your line item budget with the blue notes. A couple notes here from the plant perspective and the wells. The plant now is going on, I think, 8 years old. And so over the last 8 years, you'll see that gradually the plant equipment repair maintenance line item has steadily increased as things in that building age and need replacing. We've also seen increases in the 2 main chemicals that we use, which is the brine salt and phosphate. There's also chlorine gas, which is a lesser cost, but those have gone up over the last few years. There's a need to develop a backup system for our SCADA system. SCADA is basically the electronic brains behind the water and sewer system. And if you have questions or more detail, Scott can appropriately go over that. And then where I was going to ask Scott to chime in is on these last couple bullet points that are considered major items. And Scott, if you would hold off on the West End water main, because we've got a slide next for that. But if you could talk about the well number 10 pump and motor rebuild, and then that analysis of the filtration media.
Yep. We have a company that comes in, Northern Pump and Well, and they do an annual test on all of our wells for us. We've been watching all of the wells and what their production is. Over the last 2 years, well 10 has been starting to drop off in its production. We're currently at more than 10% lost what its design production is, and it's continuing to decline on a, it's starting to really go. So it becomes a cost benefit thing. You start paying much more for electricity to pump the water and getting less water for it. So we have to do this, and when you pull these pumps out, you also do a cleaning of the rock hole, because you can also lose production by having that start to get crusted up with things. If you don't do these types of things, it can be much worse down the road. In fact, you might even have to replace and drill new wells, that type of thing. So it's appropriate. It has been planned. It's been planned all along that from that project 8 years ago that we would be having to start to rebuild these pumps on an average of 7 to 8 years. We're getting a little bit more out of some of the other ones in our capital improvement plan. If we went back to those spreadsheets, you'd see that I had planned on doing these, spacing them out year after year after year, starting last year. So it was expected. The filter media, that's the in the water plant, in those big vessels, there's media in there that the water runs through. It's part of the treatment for iron as well as the softening. Our radium numbers have been climbing. The city does have a history of having problems with radium in the aquifer, and the testing that's been done so far was at lower levels, but this last year we did some tests and things were a little bit higher. So we also had planned in our CIP, when we were told that the new plant went online, that the media would have to be replaced about every 15 years. It's appropriate for us now to come in, take some sampling of the media that's inside the tanks, evaluate it, see if we're on track for that, or if we need to be planning something different. To that media, to wholesale go in and take all of the media out, we're getting into a 6-figure project. So this is something that we want to know before we're in an urgent situation.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Scott, can you touch on the finishing up of the water liability study too? That's the last bullet point there.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, we've been working on that. It's actually something that we've been spending some of our time on as we work from home and that type of thing. We believe we're going to come very close to having it finished before the existing fiscal year is out, but there's a possibility that it's going to trail into next year a little bit. We've been meeting with C2AE on Zoom meetings like this and moving forward on things. But that model, I have the opportunity to really do the wellhead protection update, because the state has not come through on some of the stuff that they were going to supply to us. We've been bugging them about it, but I think they're in the same boat of trying to get people to be able to do things in the COVID situation. The other aspect of the study that had been talked about the last time we talked to council was that we're going to do some water quality and some tracing things with water age in the system. And I don't think we're going to be able to get to that before the fiscal year ends. This project's been going on for a while, but part of that has been the work with updating our GIS system, and then all of the things that we've had to do the last 2 or 3 years, reacting to the changes that came down from the state for the Flint project, or the Flint problems, going through all of our records, getting water service information in there, lead service line issues, that type of stuff. So it's kind of set us behind on getting this project done. Now those other things are behind us, and we've gotten everything into the state, and have been, so far the state's said that we've done an exemplary job on those, but we got to get this reliability study done, because it will show up as a kind of a black mark on us that we don't have this done yet.
Okay, last item, which we've got a helpful graphic here for, has to do with a water quality issue that we have on the west side of town on Grand River. So in this red box area, this is Corwin Road, this is Grand River, so this is Beckham in the top right, this is Old Nation, and then this building here is currently it's Michigan Woodworking. I think it was the Demmer building at some point for those that have been around a while. And so we've been working through a couple of different ideas based on the water system needs over here. And we also have a need to use the last bit of money that's remaining from the 2017 bond issue, which is in our water fund. After accounting for the Middle and Mullet water work this year, there should be about between $30,000 and $40,000 remaining, which isn't quite enough to go do a water main down a street, or a major, water system improvement. So we've been looking at some of the smaller needs that exist in the system that this could be used for. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Scott to just give us a rundown of, the issue with the hydrants back there, the dead end water main, as well as the future looping needs. Scott.
Yeah, and Corey referenced the hydrants and the issues there. There's actually 2 fire hydrants that have been a problem. One is closer to Grand River between the buildings. Many people probably have noticed that hydrant, about where he's got the cursor now, has been hit, I think, like 4 times since Old Nation has opened up. When they did the paving last year, we asked them, because the hydrant had been hit just before the paving again, we said, hey, keep that open. We're going to have to abandon that water or that fire hydrant right there. The cost of fixing that on a dead end line, because that's also the end of a water line that runs towards the north towards the Grand River. Before I even started with the city, they used to loop around back to Corwin. And there was a leak out in front of that building. And at that time, the city abandoned the connection back to Corwin, and that fire hydrant became the end of the line. Well, whenever you have dead end lines, you have water quality problems, especially when there's not enough usage on that line. As you go further to the south, where the brighter white part of the Demmer building is, yep, right in there, that's where their service comes into the building. Well, their service is a 4-inch line going into the building, and it used to have a lot of water being used in the building because Demmer used water in their cutting process. Well, now that's not the case, and the woodworking place that's there has a bathroom and some other, small usage, and there's a large volume of water that is getting very stale, stagnant, and nasty. Further south along that line, there's right about there, there's an old fence line, and buried in that fence is another old fire hydrant that's broken. So we have many thousands of dollars that would have to be in here to fix these fire hydrants just to leave a line that does not have very much usage on it, and they still have poor water quality. So an alternate solution is that we go further south, there's a line that runs east and west just south of that property line. And yeah, pretty close. And there's a newer fire hydrant back in there. Yep, right about there. And if we go to the west of there, we can come to the north to, well, that building that he was just on is served by the Jackson Oven, and they do have a water draw there. But between there and the other fire hydrant, we can tap on, run a new service in of a smaller diameter into the building that way, where they've got a garage area and it's cheaper to come in, and basically offset the money that the city would be spending to fix those other fire hydrants, and set up Michigan Woodworking with a smaller diameter line that would take care of their needs. And then they would pay for the portion to do things internal to their building and so forth. We would just take care of running that line up there, and then capping off that old line that runs to the north between Old Nation and Michigan Woodworking building. And the other part of this is we've talked with the owner and said, hey, we would want to have an easement to go on the west side of your building up to Grand River, so that someday we can run that water main up there and then get it towards the west slightly and cross Grand River, thereby creating a looped system in that area. Currently, everything to the west of Corwin Road and all of the subdivisions to the north of Grand River, NISA, all of that is on one dead end system, because there's only one line on the north side of Grand River. And if that line were to break, we have hundreds of customers that are out of service. So by getting this eventual future loop on the other side of the entrance to, I'm forgetting the name there, that road right across from Denver there. Anyways, yeah, if we get it to the west of there, we would then tie in on the other side of a valve. And if the line on the north side of Grand River broke, we could still feed water up through this way and eliminate that problem of the dead end and customers without service. So that's the long range plan, but the short first step in that is to solve this problem with Michigan Woodworking and get rid of a couple of fire hydrants. We've talked about the fire hydrants with NISA, and the fire chief went over there, evaluated all the other existing hydrant locations and said, nope, it's fine, you guys, we don't have a need for those two fire hydrants. So what we've talked about is a combined effort working with Mark Stevens, with our staff, and he gave us on like a per day basis. He thinks it would take about 3 days of work to abandon those fire hydrants and get that other service line in there. Our equipment staff would be used for as much as we can, but we would need him to run that trench with the pipe up to the building over there. I guess that kind of covers it.
And Scott, I think a
Scott?
piece of this to, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Noah.
Yeah, I was just asking, does that water line also run up? If I remember, we talked a long time ago about the back of Bartage's farmland, that had that one tap out there in that farmland, which is just, yeah, right in there. Up higher. Bartage's farm is the one right across from NISA right there, but there used to be a tap or something that you were talking to him about that was under the plowed land. Is that a water?
No, that's actually sewer, Noah.
Okay. Just I didn't remember if it was sewer or water, because that would be
Yeah.
another possible tap in down that way to loop back into as well.
It is actually. If where Corey's got the cursor now, that field is owned by Bartage's, and it is a potential development land. It is a land that we have incorporated in our long-term planning for service area, because we have to size lines and so forth. So you're correct. If that ever develops, that would be another way that the loop would be made too.
Okay, cool. Okay, thank you.
We have had many questions come from the, it doesn't show on this, but is it Eagle Point condos down there on Zimmer, or Zimmer Place? I can't remember what they call themselves now. But that, as well as the complex that Spags is in, they've had a lot of problems with their water wells and so forth in that area with back decounts, and the Eagle folks have been asking me almost on an annual basis, can we get water down there? Well, it actually becomes, yeah, water can go there, and we've got the capacity, but someone's got to bear the cost of running those lines, and that would be probably a special assessment district or something like that, and it would entail that likely that neighborhood that's on the south side of Grand River that we already have sewer service in, but not water service. So that would probably have the township involved as well.
You know, Scott, that's a sort of dovetails into a question I'm wondering, you know, even for Corey is, you know, as we talk about these infrastructure changes we're making, are we giving some foresight into future growth in terms of, you know, running lines a little farther? I mean, you know, to encourage development within the community, or is it more just sort of like a reactive scenario where we're just trying to like make sure what's there is taken care of as opposed to the future of what could be?
Yeah, very good question, Jeff. That is exactly what we do. The water reliability study, and then another thing that when we get done with the wastewater treatment plant, but also with the wastewater treatment plant, is we have taken a look at the surrounding areas around the city, looked at what the development possibilities are, what's cost effective, and you have to plan for those future demands as you replace other lines within your system. You might need to upsize it one size. That's not as big of a cost as just the actual replacement of the pipe itself. The wastewater treatment plant has to be designed with extra capacity to it. The water wells, the towers, the water plant, the collection system on the sewer side. So once we get done with the wastewater treatment plant study, I've already been talking with Corey about how we have a strong need. The last time we did a collection system study was in 2005. So we're overdue for doing a collection system study. The city has done a very good job of following the recommendations in the sewer studies in the past, as well as the water studies in the past. But every, 8 years, 10 years, 15 years, you really have to step back and say, okay, we accomplished all these things. What's the demand look like now? What does the future plans look like for development and so forth? So yeah, we are, to answer your question short, we are taking that stuff into consideration and sizing on future projects.
Thanks, appreciate that.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Scott, for helping us with that explanation. So, at this point, we've got a budget in there for this project, knowing that it wouldn't start till the summer. And certainly there would be more discussion and actual requests to come before council. But since that one is looming and it's part of this 2017 bond money, we wanted to take just a couple more minutes to go over that. So I appreciate everybody's patience and questions. So what does this mean for the water fund? And this is the same thing we just talked about on the sewer side. We should be generating a surplus of about $49,000 a year to meet that RRI requirement. This year, we should meet that at the end of this year. And that RRI balance is just north of about $100,000. So not quite as healthy as the sewer one. But I think as most of our council will recall, last year, we raised the readiness to serve charge by about 16%. And a big chunk of that was to get us on track to actually generate a surplus. And so we are on that path. That said, this fund is not as positioned as the sewer fund to absorb no rate increase. And so it is projected to spend down some of its RRI funds more so than the sewer fund in the next year. Certainly by designating some of this work to the remaining bond proceeds, that will help. But at the end of the day, we're still looking at dipping into the RRI account for doing some of these other projects. And so to kind of bring this home, when we think about rate setting and the considerations for either recommending an increase or not, we have a 10-year forecast that we update annually for water and sewer funds based on current operations and minimizing a lot of capital. And so based on that, we had projected that we would be coming to you for a 2% rate increase across the board to start July 1st. And similarly to what we just discussed with the road funding and the bond language, our attempt has been to not ask for that rate increase, considering that a lot of our businesses and residents may just be going back to work as the summer rolls around. And so at this point, we're not asking for that. We would like to keep the door open to revisiting that for a mid-year increase if the economy gets back to a point where it may be more appropriate. But at the same time, the budget is built without one, so it assumes that revenue will stay flat. The impact of that is that we have to hit those RRI balances, which, again, that's what they're there for. They are meant for the purpose of investing in your system. But it's just a slightly different path that we were hoping to take when we were doing this discussion this time last year. Before I move to DDA and TIFA, I just want to check if there's any other water sewer questions. Okay, hearing none. This is just a brief update on our component units. So neither of these boards have met during the COVID deal. We have not done so they still have to meet to discuss their budgets and potential projects. But some of the things that are out there, and Dan had asked a question about this earlier, was our boardwalk replacement grant, which is a replacement of the existing wooden boardwalk that is in Old Mill Park in downtown. We have a grant lined up through our regional transportation planning organization. And then we also have a grant that has been awarded, but there's not a signed deal yet for the addition of a parking lot with about 17 spaces and a canoe and kayak boat launch on the west end of downtown, one lot next to the Barbell Club. The DDA often calls it the old car wash site, as there was a car wash there years ago. DDA has owned that since the 90s and has had recognized in many plans to put something there that activates the river and people's ability to use that river. And so we went through the grant process toward the end of 2019 and beginning of this year. And that grant was going to be contingent on the Ingham County Parks and Recreation millage renewing on March 10th, which it did. But we have not heard anything from them as far as a grant agreement in this month or two that we've had since then. So the match for that project is $15,000, which the DDA agreed to support. The match on the boardwalk replacement grant, we are still working through some newly discovered issues in our DDA fund with our ability to capture other millages. And so we have some work yet to do. This is an emergent thing that we just learned last week. And so we're still working through that. I know the DDA from their meeting at the beginning of this year was eager to sponsor that project should they have the money available. But we're still working through what exactly that looks like and how they can do that if they do not have the cash on hand to make the match happen. And so we've still got some work to do and discussion to have with DDA on that. As far as our TIFA, The TIFA has not done anything for the last 2 years as far as projects go. The TIFA has been slowly building up its fund balance in anticipation of doing further projects in their area, which comprises basically the original industrial park, which is where like Amerisource Bergen is at, Midwest Rotary Die or Midway Rotary Die, as well as the DPW building and the buildings that are on Elevator Street just south of the railroad tracks. And so we will definitely have more to say on the ice house, which is the old barn that's on Elevator Street. We've been working with a group of individuals that are interested in redeveloping that property. Frankly, we just hadn't heard a whole lot from them in the last 2 months. I do have a call planned tomorrow with the principal of that group to see where they are at. In the same breath, the city has explored an infrastructure project to upgrade the water and sewer down Elevator Street that both activates the ice house property as well as on the water side would replace, and actually it would be a new water main crossing underneath the railroad tracks, which would replace 2 older railroad crossing or water main railroad crossings that exist that is identified as a system need. And so it's a way to get a water main project done within the TIFA district that has benefits to both the immediate TIFA district as well as the city's wider water system. When we first got that project scoped out, needless to say, it was very expensive. Putting a water main underneath a railroad is not cheap work, but that fund is well positioned to sponsor a project like that. And so the next phase is to really begin that discussion in earnest with the TIFA board and see if there's a way to tie that work in with the potential sale and redevelopment of the ice house. And so again, I should know a little bit more in the morning from the folks that we had entered into a letter of intent with to explore this sale, to see where they're at in their planning and desire to try to keep moving forward. So more to come on those once those boards have a chance to meet and discuss their budget. But since it is incorporated into the city's budget, I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of a brief background on the key things that they're looking at. So with that is the last of the slides, other than a slide that discusses next steps. These meetings are usually pretty detailed and intense, and so here we are, it's almost 9 o'clock. But I wanted to see if there's anything that council in an immediate way would like more information on or have questions on that staff can either answer now or work on in the coming days.
I have a quick question going back to the boardwalk project for a minute. I know it's the DDA has expressed interest in that, but you also mentioned that they may have some budgetary concerns with some things. I remember at one point when we talked about this, it wasn't an immediate need at that time. It was a need that we do repairs on the boardwalk, but it wasn't immediate. I'm sure that's moving along. If the DDA has monetary issues with their budget, is this something we're going to have to look at this year in the city budget for that match?
It's a good question, Dan, and one I wish I had a better, firmer answer for. So if I back up a couple months, the DDA was 100% behind supporting the project, and really this issue with the capture emerged, frankly, last week. And so we're still working through that, and I've got a couple ideas that we're pursuing in the coming days and weeks. The key issue is that there's been this project has been set aside through this regional transportation planning group as a grant, and so our match on the grant side is about $62,000, but they don't cover the cost to design, engineer, and bid the project. And so typically that amount is somewhere between 15 and 20%. But because this goes through the MDOT program, you're almost definitely going to be at the 20% range. And so that would be, our match is 20%, which is 62,000. And so typically for engineering, if you're doing another 20%, now all of a sudden you're at about 125,000. And so if it was just the match, I would say we've probably got some different ways to do this. But because we need both components, it's something I just am not ready to answer yet. The worst case scenario is that we let the grant expire because we can't come up with the match and an engineering component. I'm not ready to go there yet because there was a lot of work that went into getting this grant through this regional process that Scott has been involved in. But really right now we're just looking to find a solution in light of the fact that the DDA may not have the revenues that we thought they were going to have a couple months ago.
Thanks, Corey. Sorry to push you on that, but I know it's been out there for a couple of years, and I know it's something we've been working on for a while.
Yeah, and what the impetus for that project is that we had a evaluation done of the boardwalk, I think about 2.5 years ago now, and that revealed a couple of immediate needs, which we were able to deal with, some midterm needs, but then really in the long term, and it was not a long time horizon, there were some real concerns structurally with that, with the support there. And so even in the last couple of years when we've had the duck race, there's been pieces of that structure that we've had to rope off out of concern for the number of people that would be standing on that. So it's okay for your average, person walking down the boardwalk, but it's not something that we put our equipment on or certainly want, a large crowd to gather on. And so that was the impetus for trying to find a resource to help with the project. And, I wish I had a better, firmer answer for you tonight, but we're working through that right now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, Corey, Jeff here. So
Yes.
I noticed in next steps, we're looking at setting a public hearing in a week, and what have you with that. One of the things that's just struck me as we've gone through this today is, do you think there's any value in establishing, what we talked about earlier, on what we can actually do as a municipality to generate revenue outside of the state? It's not saying we're doing this, but sometimes the state just gets in front of us, wherever we live, whether it's Nevada, Florida, California, New York, Michigan, the governor's ruling gets in front of us and we get stuck in that moment. Is there value in just reanalyzing that? And maybe we can open up some level of revenue that readdresses this budget that we might want to reconsider. I don't know. I know. Are we 11th hour? Maybe we are. I don't know. But I don't know if you see any value there.
So it's a good question, and somewhat of a complex answer, but I'll try to do it in just a brief explanation. So cities in Michigan, we are constrained rather severely in what we can generate from revenue. We can do property taxes, and then we get state shared revenue, and then whatever fees we generate, which are really supposed to be cost neutral. So, if you have a building department, the fees you generate should not be to generate a profit, but rather to cover the cost of the service. So there are some states that can levy a local sales tax. There's counties that can do that. I think Gene Smith has brought up, it was Pasco County that had the penny for Pasco, which was an awesome idea, and we're not able to do that in Michigan by state statute. And so all of a sudden, when you start looking at all the different things that cities do to generate revenue, probably the one revenue source that would actually, that there would be a benefit to that would be if there was a local income tax. Right now, I think cities that have income taxes are hurting more so than those of us that were reliant on property taxes, because property taxes are fairly stable and they're inelastic. And your income taxes, all of a sudden, if payroll plummets across the board in your private sector, you're going to feel that immediately. And so those are the revenue sources that cities in Michigan can try to do. You can't do them without a vote of the people. So in the very short term, the revenue that is impacted by businesses being open, which would be your income taxes and your sales tax activity, we cannot benefit from directly, other than the fact that if they're open, they're remitting those payments to the state, and then we get it as a pass-through. And so I would say that in the very short term, that would be difficult for us to see any sort of benefit from the tax side. Now that's not ignoring some of the other impacts of just having a robust economy as a city and what that means for it being attractive to people to come to and support. But from strictly a revenue standpoint, I don't think that we would see that benefit in the very short term without the ability to have some of those other revenue sources that we're just not able to have right now.
That's interesting. I appreciate that feedback hugely. That makes a lot of sense, but definitely look forward to the other analysis next time we meet up as it relates to authorities and potentially reopening some local businesses. But no, appreciate that feedback. Thanks so much, Corey.
No problem. Okay, so on that note, we will typically ask council if there's a need for a second workshop or discussion. Right now I'm sensing that there's not, but if that's the case, then our schedule of events for the budget would be to set a public hearing, which could happen as soon as May 11th. And we would hold that hearing at the second meeting in May. That hearing has to be advertised in a newspaper, posted on our website. And then the final vote would happen at the first meeting in June. And so while we are about 3 weeks off of where we would normally be, we still are on track to adopt the budget per the date that our charter says, assuming that there's not, great revisions that come out of either this meeting, the May 11th meeting, or the public hearing on May 25th. So at this point, I guess I just would look for any feedback on, the schedule, and if council is comfortable moving forward, or if there's a sense for a need for more information, which you can either follow up now or, call or email me later.
I would say move forward with with that schedule that you have there.
I'm comfortable with moving forward.
Agree.
I agree also, and I'd like to compliment Rachel, Corey, and Holly, and Scott for doing such a great job at your presentation. It was clear, concise, and I like the format that we did it in.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, I appreciate the feedback and certainly extend the thanks to the staff for helping get through this. It's been definitely the most interesting budget I've ever worked on because I said it a million times, like we had a draft done March 10th and then the world changed. And so it was a lot of flexing to get to this point and ultimately just making some educated assumptions that very well could not come true as we learn where exactly this is all going to go. So I just appreciate council's patience in getting to this evening and appreciate the attentiveness and the questions tonight, particularly doing this like this where I'm on a phone, on a laptop, and I can't see any of you. Just appreciate everybody's patience. All right, so I think with that, then we can close the meeting.
Thanks again, Corey, and you guys. You rock.
You did great, Corey.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep.
Good
Thanks,
job.
Jeff.